Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third in the session, Arthur, the Once and Future King. By now, you know you are in Nancy Dickson's capable hands when it comes to explaining the complicated background and the development of the Arthurian myth. I'm especially intrigued as to why, for 1,000 years, the Arthur myth has captivated readers and storytellers alike and is still a subject of debate. I found just this week a wonderful article in the Smithsonian Magazine, May 2022, that explains it this way. There is something in the Arthur legend for everyone. The story of King Arthur has got flawed characters with whom we can empathize, quests to achieve impossible goals, and an adaptable storyline that fits the socio-political landscape of the time. So here's Nancy, over and out to you to continue the story.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see you out of the rain and thunder and lightning going on out there. I'd like to start just by doing a brief mention about movies. There will be movies every Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock, except the last one, which will be at 2:30, but I'll let you know ahead of time about that. Now, movies are made, obviously, for a modern audience with an emphasis on what the producer and director think the modern audience wants to see. And if you say medieval to a modern audience, they're going to think knights in shining armor. So those of you who saw Excalibur last Saturday saw the fact that these knights wear their armor when they fall into the river, when they walk into their wives' bedchamber. They wear their armor all the time, so you know they're knights. There's also a lot of fighting. So that means that these movies have a lot of blood and gore because that's what the directors think the audience is going to be expecting. Now, for those of you who have said you do not like a lot of blood and gore, I'll give you the preview so you can select your films. Next Saturday is going to be A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. There is that much blood and gore in that film. It's based on a book by Mark Twain, which was written about 135 years ago. So we've got a long time span. The movie was made in 1949. So there have been a lot of changes. And the things that just amazed audiences when the film came out, 70 years ago, were astonishing to the theater audience of those days. And they're not astonishing to us today because it's like Dick Tracy movies where he talks to his watch. And as kids, we went, what? What's he doing? Well, people do that all the time now. They talk to their watch. The next film after that is going to be First Night, which you can expect is going to be in the same genre as Excalibur. So if you don't like blood and gore, give that one a miss. Then we have Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which does in fact have a lot of blood, but everybody's laughing. You can't take it seriously. It's a spoof. And then there's the musical Camelot, which also does not have a lot of blood and gore. They mopped it all out to begin with. So that's the lineup for the films, and we'll be talking more about those as we go along. Now, I'm sorry. I'm hearing somebody talk. Are you talking? Oh, I couldn't figure out where the voice was coming from. Sorry. Um, so there were major changes after William the Conqueror did his conquering thing. This is a slide of the British Isles before William. And if you'll notice, the pink area is pretty much what the Romans had held 1,000 years earlier. And this is the land held by William after the conquest. And this is just a comparison slide of the changes. And then we'll be talking about Eleanor of Aquitaine a little bit farther into this class, but I wanted to show you this map while we were looking at maps. And these are the lands that were held by Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Henry II. And you can see it's a huge swath all the way down what is the west coast of Europe. Okay. There's one missing, sorry. Oops. Okay, here we go. Major changes that happened following the conquest. And I'm using that very purposefully as a divisor because remember last week when we saw all of the things we expected to find in Arthur and they weren't there in the earlier stories? Well, after the conquest, we've got several changes. This section of the world that had been at war ever since the Romans left in 400 now enters into an era of peace. All of a sudden, into the stories, we have women, not just as appendages to men or servants to men, but as writers and political activists, powerful women who affected their world. We also have new sources, new means of recording history. I'm going to talk about the Bayeux Tapestry, which was not a written source, but an embroidered source that gave the whole history of William's conquering of England. The languages were no longer determined by who was the invader, who was the controller, who was the ruler, but they were divided in three by socioeconomic class. And this was totally new for this part of the world. So, come on, how did you manage to get so scrambled? I'm sorry, the slides have decided to present themselves in their own particular order. The first major change, the peace that ensued, was brought about by William's conquest. For decades, William tried to subdue the lands to the north, what's at green, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, but he had no more success in doing that than the Romans had had 1,600 years earlier. Now, what was the effect of this on the Arthurian stories? Well, it was huge because the stories of Arthur and his men fighting the Saxons were no longer appropriate. This just wasn't happening because, as I said, there was peace. So the stories of fighting off invaders was no longer interesting. But what you have, because for 600 years, people had been busy training fighters and warriors to keep the invaders at bay. Now, all of a sudden, you've got all these trained warriors, but what are they supposed to do? Nobody's attacking. It's like having a group of 2-year-olds on a sugar high or a group of teenage boys with nothing to do. It's not, it's a recipe for disaster, is what it is. So part of what the storytellers had to do was come up with a thing, something for these warriors to do. And what was added to the stories at this point? Anybody have an idea? Shout it out. Sports, there was the jousting and the tournaments, but there were also all the quests. There was the quest for the Holy Grail, and nobody's ever figured out exactly what that is. There were also quests to rescue damsels in distress and to go off and explore new lands. But instead of fighting, these knights were now questing and jousting, still able to get hurt doing that, but it was a different sort of time. Let's see if I can find. Okay, another part of the Arthurian legend that was created during William's peace, not the Pax Romana, but the Pax William, whatever the Latin form of William is, involved the magical land of the Celts. And this idea was resurrected from the Celtic stories that had been passed down orally in Brittany, which is that farthest most western part of France, and they hadn't been attacked. The land was settled by Celtic escapees from Britain when it was under attack, and they settled there and they lived pretty much peacefully and safely for 400 or 500 years. And they were able to keep their stories going and the other world stories. The story of Cullagh and Olwen, for example, came from Brittany. Because the stories from Brittany evolved on their own, they differed from the stories that evolved in Britain. From Brittany, we have the Forest of Brocéliande, the Isle of Avalon, and the Celtic otherworld continues to live. Worlds that exist just beyond the realm of man and entered through a mist by mistake in quest of a fairy princess, or, as we saw in Excalibur, a land of enchantment and magic. Because these stories, or versions of existing tales, were written during a time of peace, we have more magic, more extraordinary beings, more mystery. There's really no mystery in taking an axe and whacking an enemy while you try to keep him from whacking you. It's just very straightforward. In these new stories, there's grace, charm, and magic. We can see in this the effect of women who were writing some of the new stories or becoming an example of a powerful female in the political arena. The first of these women that I'd like to talk about today is Eleanor of Aquitaine. And this is a picture of her riding off to the Crusades with her husband, King Henry. Now, she was the Duchess of Aquitaine, which is the southernmost part of France that goes down along the coast south of Brittany. And she was ruler in her own right. She went on to become queen consort with both Louis VII of France and Henry II of England, the mother of two kings, Richard the Lion-Hearted and John of England, neither of whom was quite the man she was. She was perhaps the most powerful woman in 12th century Europe. Now, how did a woman rise to power? When her only brother and her father died in 1137, she was left with a vast inheritance. She was 15 years old, 3 years younger than Victoria was when she took power, and she'd suddenly become the most eligible heiress in Europe. That same year, she married Louis of France, who shortly afterwards became King Louis VII. The couple had 2 daughters, which brought trouble, as I'll tell you later. And this is the 2 of them. 10 years later, Eleanor accompanied her husband on the Second Crusade, traveling to Constantinople and Jerusalem. Pretty much unheard of for a woman in her era. The crusade was a failure, as many of you probably already know, and the relations between Eleanor and her husband, already poor, in part because of Eleanor's outrageous conduct during this expedition. At the court of her uncle Raymond of Poitiers, she aroused her husband's jealousy and marked the beginning of their estrangement. She was known as an absolutely outrageous flirt. And someone with enough power, when we get to the story of Lanval, you'll see where some of the ideas for that story may have come from. After she and her husband returned to France, their relationship deteriorated even farther, in large part because of her inability to produce a son. Now, we know today that the outcome of son or daughter is determined by the man, but in those days it was blamed on the woman. It was all her fault. She was being difficult. So here is a woman defying tradition and getting away with it. Whispers of infidelity were often enough to cause a woman to be put to death. For example, as was threatened to Guinevere in Excalibur. Instead, she got their marriage annulled in 1152. 2 months later, she married Henry of Anjou, later King of England. The couple had 5 sons and 3 daughters. So guess whose fault it was? For nearly 2 decades, Eleanor played an active part in the running of Henry's empire, traveling back and forth between their territories in England and France. Let's see if we can get, yeah, the gold, dark gold is their territories. When she was 48, 2 of Eleanor's sons involved her in a plot against their father, and Henry had her imprisoned. After Henry's death, his son Richard the Lionhearted ordered his mother's release. Despite her age, she was now in her mid-60s, which was considered really old in the 12th century. Eleanor became very closely involved in government. When Richard went off to join the Third Crusade, she assumed the role of Queen of England, and all the laws were on the edict of the Queen, not the king. She played a part in negotiating her son's release after he was taken prisoner on his way home from the Crusades. When Richard died, he was succeeded by Eleanor and Henry's youngest son, John. Yeah, he's the one that the poem was written about. King John was not a good man. He was so horrible that he spurred his barons' uprising against him and forced the Magna Carta. When she was 80, she crossed the Pyrenees to bring her daughter back to France to try to secure peace by marrying her to the then King of France. She outlived all but one of her sons, and toward the end of her life, she went into the Abbey of Fontevraud, where the nuns wrote of her on her death, quote, "She surpassed all of the queens who have ever lived." I love the tombs of the two of them. Let's see if we can get that up. Yep, there it is. So that is Henry on the right, clearly sound asleep, resting. She's propped up in bed reading a book. And I love it because, women in those days weren't supposed to read. She was 82 when she died after a long and adventurous life. Now, in addition to her political involvement, she was instrumental in turning the court of Poitiers into a center of poetry and a model of courtly life and manners. Her court became a breeding ground for Arthurian stories and tales. She was the great patron of the two dominant poetic movements of the time, most especially the courtly love tradition conveyed in the romantic stories of the troubadours. It was, oh, come on. Okay, I give up. Let's see if we can find something a little bit more interesting to look at. Yeah, that's kind of pretty. Now, courtly love poetry and stories featured a lady, usually married, but always in some way inaccessible, who became the object of a noble knight's devotion, service, and self-sacrifice. Prior to the development of this genre, women appeared in medieval literature as secondary characters who were the possession of their husbands or fathers. Afterward, women featured prominently in literary works as clearly defined individuals. Arthurian tradition expands to include Tristan and Iseult, Lanval, and others. In the relationship between Lancelot and Guinevere, we see the two traditions of wife as possession and courtly lady as the object of courtly love, and they clash in many of the stories in which they appear. In part because in many of the stories, the relationship between Guinevere and Lancelot was sexually fulfilled, which was not supposed to be part of courtly love. And their relationship did not remain a secret, and that also was supposed to be a part of courtly love. Nobody knows who my lady is, and we'll see that in the story of Lanval, which I'll tell you in just a few minutes. Now, what does this strong woman have to do with King Arthur? Well, the bards, and at this point the authors writing stories of King Arthur, wrote them, as they always had, for a powerful benefactor. Benefactor? That's how they got their money. They'd write a story, they'd give it to their benefactor, he'd say, oh, you really made me look good in this story. Here's a pocket of money. Writing these stories for a powerful woman caused them or encouraged them to change the stories to show women in Arthurian literature as powerful figures, rather than the hostages to fortune that they were in the earlier tales. So during the period of Eleanor's rule, virtually everything that you think of as part of the Arthurian tradition was added to these stories. The Grail quest, Lancelot, the sword Excalibur, Uther Pendragon, his father, the magician Merlin, Arthur's wife Guinevere, Arthur's conception through magic at Tintagel, his final battle against Mordred, and final rest in Avalon, the Round Table, many, many knights and ladies. And during this time, they quit writing in Latin. The only people who still used Latin were the priests and monks, and they weren't particularly encouraged to read the romances. They needed to stick to the church stuff. Now, the other woman who actively shaped the stories was Marie de France. I'd love to show you a picture, but I can't because the slides are rebelling, and because over the past centuries, actually 1,000 years, her identity has remained a mystery. We have no idea. What we do know is that she was a prolific writer, active in the 11th and 12th century, who wrote stories with Arthurian themes and characters, added strong women, or changed the roles of women already in the stories. Lanville is such a story. I know I've got this one in here. This is the Wheel of Fortune, which was a theme that came up in the big, looks like a spinning wheel in the upper right-hand corner. And the idea was that everybody living was somewhere on the Wheel of Fortune. And as the wheel went around, you'd go lower and lower. Sometimes you'd fall off completely. But then, like the South, you'd rise again to the top of the Wheel of Fortune. Okay, Lanville was a knight from King Arthur's court. He had many, many great qualities, including both beauty and valor. And as a result, he was envied by many of the other knights who would not have grieved if he'd suffered misfortune. Such envy is manifest in his standing at court. When Arthur's handing out goodies to his knights that he appreciates, he never gave Lanville anything, despite Lanville's loyal service. And the other knights make no attempt to help him. They're all jealous. He was born far, far away from Arthur's court and has long since spent his inheritance. He lives a sad and lonely life. One day, he went out into the country to contemplate his fate. When he approached a stream, his horse grew frightened, so he let his horse loose and lay down to revel in his sadness. I love that image, just revel in the sadness. Haven't you ever been there? Yeah, I have. A while later, he sees two beautiful damsels approaching, one with gold dishes and the other with a towel. He stands to greet them, and they explain that they have come to take him to their mistress, who waits in a nearby tent. Lanville leaves his horse and accompanies them to a magnificent tent, finely adorned, so fine that a great emperor could not have afforded even the right-hand side of it. Isn't that a wonderful way of putting things? Even finer is the lady within, who surpassed in beauty the lily and the new rose when it appears in summer. She lies half covered amidst other fine adornments. The maiden tells Lanville she has come in search of him from her deep love for him, and should he prove himself worthy, she will grant him a happiness without equal. He sees her beauty and is equally struck with love, so much so that he promises he would do whatever she might ask. Dangerous. At his promise, they sleep together and are joined in love. She grants him the boon that he would never wish or want for anything. And in fact, the more he spent in life, the more he would have to continue spending. Bottomless purse. He is granted lodging in her tent, food, and wonderful clothing. The only requirement that she asks is that he tell nobody
about her or their love, or else he will lose her forever. After a long time together, she tells him he must leave and tells him that any time he wishes to see her, he merely needs to think of a pure place and she will join him there. That night, after he returned to Arthur's court, he almost begins to doubt the existence of the lady. But when he sees his men, they are as finely dressed as he is. From that moment on, he becomes the embodiment of generosity, giving gifts freely, granting pardon to prisoners, and offering hospitality to all, even as guests cannot determine where his wealth is coming from. All the while, he finds joy in visiting his beloved anytime he wishes. Later that year, several knights are relaxing in a garden when Gawain realizes that Lanville is not with them and chastises his group for having neglected to include Lanville. Gawain takes a group to fetch Lanville, who comes willingly. Meanwhile, Queen Guinevere sees Lanville through her window and wants him. She devises a plan. She dresses in her most magnificent gown and brings several ladies out to the garden. The girls are quickly approached by the knights, but Lanville, who has retreated from the crowd to dream of his own lady, is approached by Guinevere. She quickly confesses her desire for him and offers herself to him. He gently rejects her advances, citing his loyalty to Arthur. Angrily, she responds by accusing him of homosexuality, suggesting that his degeneracy has affected Arthur. And here, Lanville makes his big mistake. Angered by her petulant accusation, he defends himself as loving and being loved by a woman of such beauty that even his beloved servant girls are superior in beauty and goodness to Guinevere. Did not go over well. Guinevere flees, upset, and takes to her room, swearing not to rise until her husband avenges the insult. When the king returns, the queen complains to him, fallaciously claiming that Lanville had attempted to seduce her, and in response to her refusal, made the claim that his beloved serving girls were superior to her. In her fury, Arthur swears that unless Lanville can defend himself in court, he will have the knight hanged. He sends barons to fetch Lanville, who, meanwhile, is in extreme guilt, having lost access to his beloved because of his failure to keep his promise. He calls to her over and over, but to no avail. And Marie says, it was a wonder he didn't kill himself. Lanville is brought to the king, who accuses him of great wrong. Though in enough sorrow to welcome death, Lanville defends himself from the queen's claims of his lechery, though he does claim the truth of his words about his beloved and her attendants. He agrees he will follow whatever decision the king's court finds, and so Arthur calls together his men to advise him. They decide to set a court date to assemble a larger jury. But this requires someone to stand bail for Lanville because he is an outcast. No one is initially willing to stand as pledge until Gawain and his men offer to take the burden. Lanville is released, and Gawain's men escort him home, chastising him for giving in to such a foolish love. Over the next few days, they keep a close eye on him, fearful that he will bring about his own death. The day of the trial comes and the barons assemble to act as jury. Arthur wishes for a speedy verdict to appease the queen, but the barons are mixed. Some wish to punish him in service of their lord's wishes, while others feel great pity for this poor man who does not hide his sadness. They decide to offer Lanville the following bargain. Since he had pledged the truth of his words, he would be acquitted if his beloved were to step forward and prove his words true. And if she does not, he will be banished or hanged. Lanville informs them she will not come to his aid. But on the verge of making their verdict, two pretty maidens approach on palfreys. They're much admired, and Gawain and his knights inform Lanville of their arrival, assuming one of these fine women must be his beloved. However, Lanville has never seen them before. Arthur receives them, and when they ask that a room be prepared in great fashion for their lady, whose arrival is impending, Arthur grants it. Desperate for a quick verdict, Arthur pressures the barons, who inform him of their deliberation, but it was interrupted again by the arrival of the ladies. They have barely resumed discussion when two more ladies arrive. These, even more beautiful and more finely adorned. Lanville, nevertheless, does not recognize either of them. They too ask for a chamber to house their arriving lady, which Arthur grants before again pressuring the barons for a quick verdict to appease the queen's wrath. Yet again, the barons are on the cusp of a verdict when a single lady appears, more beautiful than anyone in the world and dressed to match. Her beauty floors all who witness her arrival. Lanville is informed of her approach, and when he recognizes her as his beloved, he swears he no longer cares for his life now that he can see her again. The lady tells Arthur that Lanville has been wrongly accused and hopes that her arrival will save him. The barons speedily attest to the accuracy of Lanville's claim, and I'm sure that didn't sit well with Guinevere, and he is freed. The lady and her attendants leave immediately, despite Arthur's attempt to keep them. On their way out of town, Lanville leaps from a high wall and lands on the lady's palfrey, and the two ride together to Avalon, never to be seen again. So once again in this story, Guinevere is portrayed in a less than admirable light. She's jealous. She's vengeful. She and Lanville's lady are in competition, fighting over one man, even though she's got Arthur. With the advent of these powerful women and women fueling Arthur's story, new means of recording history came in. So many of the early stories of Arthur were embedded in the histories which had been written based on legend, oral tradition, et cetera, But with the beginning of this new millennium, we find new means of recording history. One spectacular example is the Bayeux Tapestry. There's just one small picture of it. The Bayeux Tapestry is an embroidered cloth nearly 230 feet long and 20 inches tall. It is embroidered with and depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest of England, led by the Duke of Normandy, William, and culminating in the Battle of Hastings. It dates to within a few years of the battle. It's the medieval version of film. here's what happened, and then this is what happened, a series of stills. It was probably made in England as a gift for William, since it tells the story from the point of view of the conquering Normans, the French coming in. The French legend maintains the tapestry was commissioned and created by Queen Matilda, William the Conqueror's wife, helped by her ladies in waiting. Now, its survival, there's only one of these, its survival over 9 centuries is just a little short of miraculous. It was stored for a while in a chest in a cathedral basement and taken out once a year to be aired. I mean, the fact that bugs didn't get into it. But beyond tapestries, there were all sorts of other markers, physical remnants, that survived because of the peace that William brought around. Gravestones, markers, and other physical items tended to remain where they were because there was no war, no fighting going on. Now, although Arthur and Guinevere's bones were dug up and moved, we have a record, written record, of them having been dug up and drawings of what it looked like when they were dug up and where they'd been. And we also have archaeologists who went back 700 years later and re-excavated the site that had been marked. And it showed that, in fact, there had been an earlier excavation at that site. Now, the bones that had been dug up were moved several times and then, of course, got lost. Somebody just didn't remember where they'd put them. But the remains of Eleanor of Aquitaine and her husband Henry were buried at the Abbey Fontainebleau, where their tombs have remained undisturbed ever since. The fourth major change, which I think I mentioned briefly a little bit ago, was language. In the past 2 classes, the languages spoken in Britain changed about every 100 years. Can you imagine having to learn new languages? I mean, most people didn't live 100 years, but you were brought up speaking one language and then somebody else came in and invaded and you had to start speaking German all of a sudden. But following William, there were 3 main languages that were the product not of conquest, but of socioeconomic status and education. Latin continued to be the language of the priests in the church, but now Anglo-Norman, a mixture of Old English and the French that William brought with him, was spoken by the wealthy, while the poor, the Anglo-Saxons, the serfs, were left speaking Anglo-Saxon. And we can see this reflected in our language today. The cow out in the field is called cow, which is an Anglo-Saxon word. But when you bring that same cow inside, butcher it, and put it on the dining table, it's called boeuf or beef. The same thing happens with a number of other animals for which we have 2 names in our modern day English. We also have 2 names for a lot of other things. For example, a chest is also called a bureau. One being obviously the Anglo-Saxon, the rough, heavy chest, and the bureau being having an air of more delicacy about it. Okay, we're now going to jump a couple hundred years and see a short film that will give you an idea of one of the more complicated stories in the Arthurian tradition. It's also one of the most popular. The name of the story is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And in this, we see the quintessential quest. Quests are part of so many of these stories. Gawain knows he's looking for the Green Chapel, but he hasn't a clue where it is. His host's wife is trying to seduce him, but he relies on his knightly vows to refuse her. But when she offers him an opportunity to save his life, he's not able to refuse that. There's also a hunt and an exchange of bounty. As the hunt escalates, there's larger and more game. The exchange game escalates, one kiss, two kisses. We see magic, shape-shifting, powerful, seductive women, and here you go. obviously, this is a vastly compressed version of what is about 100-page story. There's lots of description of riding through the deep snow and fierce animals encountered and the beauty of the court, but it does give you, I think, a real good view of what one of these stories boils down to. It's got everything. It's got magic. It's got shape-shifting. It's got testing of honor. It's got questing. I can't think of a single thing that's left out. So, questions, comments?
Well, Nancy, thanks once again for untangling the threads that come together to create the Arthur story as we know it. And today, I think we've learned what warriors do when there's no more war to wage. Questions? Well, that was great fun. I'm wondering, where did you find that remarkable cartoon?
Well, I wanted to have, I love Gawain and the Green Knight.
Right.
And I tried to condense it down so that I could tell it to you here in class. And I figured at about 2.5 hours, you would all be trickling out of the room. And then the film of Gawain and the Green Knight is just horrible. I mean, it's, if you thought the harem dancing girls in Excalibur were over the top, well, Gawain and the Green Knight is worse than that. So then I found this cute little thing, and you're not going to forget that story. I guarantee it. You know, the first, I mean, just the image of the head popping off and the fountain, it's like, well, kind of like Monty Python. Now, one question I have for you all. Are there any of you who would be interested in giving over part of the last class time to talk about the films, or would you rather just continue with the stories right straight up to the end? Think about it. I'll get feedback next week or the week after, or you can email me or whatever.
Okay, very nicely done. Thank you, everybody.